G'day. You'll have to excuse me. I was going to indulge in some low-key, hopefully copyright-free music while I talked, but it's far too annoying. So I shall do without. As my door opens with the draft behind me. If you hear weird background noises, it's because I'm currently sharing this particular room with 7 Great Danes, 1 big one and 6 little ones. The big one's asleep on my bed, and the 6 little ones are asleep on the floor. The mother dog is avoiding her rugrats by perching herself on the end of my bed for cuddles. Just give her a rub with my foot. And the little ones are down on the floor. So, once again, I am back with my, well, shall we call it podcast? My vlog, shall we call it? I podcast on all kinds of things, but I thought I would start vlogging so that you've got, a face to the name. Not sure if you want to see my face. Fair, as faces go. It has served me well. 51 years it's been on the front of my head and hasn't offended too many people. But it's mine. Although I think, look, I got my eyebrows on yesterday. And my nails, quite obviously. Fabulous nails. By Beauty by Linda of Kilchimar. And my eyebrows do look fabulous, but they're a bit Joan. Well, can you be too Joan Crawford? I don't think so. But have you ever seen that picture of the Chihuahua, the really sketchy-looking Chihuahua with drawn-on eyebrows? Is that what I look like? I can't help thinking I look like, or yes, it is a very odd thing, eyebrows, isn't it? It makes a difference with expression. I suppose it's a chimpanzee thing, isn't it? Chimps. Look, I have a very mobile scalp, mobile eyebrows. I'm constantly mugging and I think, is that related back to trauma, do you think? Chimpanzees are pack animals and they have to communicate all the time, and I have a theory that if you're a little girl who grows up with trauma or in terror of being misunderstood, because you often are, then you develop wildly extravagant expressions in order for people to know exactly what you are saying and thinking in order that you're not misunderstood, so that you're safer. When I was having my 5th child in hospital, it was under extraordinarily traumatic circumstances because my first husband had suddenly died about 11 weeks before I was in hospital to be induced with my 5th child. And I had a fabulous birth partner, as it were, one of my best friends. But you know what hospitals are like, hospital routines is always like, well, the doctor's going to come and do his rounds shortly, he'll probably see you then. So we were sitting around for ages, not much happening, and my friend said to me, look, I'm starving, I have to go to the canteen and get something, I'm going to die, I'm famished. And of course, as soon as she left the room, my doctor came in, the ob-gyn came in, with a little device on the end of his finger that designed to break my waters and induce the birth of my child. I'm very much hardwired to protect the being inside my womb, like it practically took wild horses to tear my knees apart. It was like huge effort of will to allow the Obgyn to induce me. I mean, I wanted to be induced. I mean, I wasn't there under duress or anything. I had, in point of fact, suggested it because I was in so much like trauma and fallout from the sudden and accidental death of my first husband, that the interminable waiting of a child that was going to be born very, very soon, on top of all the trauma, plus the fact that the baby in utero had basically stopped growing the day her father passed away, and so wasn't sort of making the progress in utero as one would hope, meant the decision to be made to induce her. And the initial procedure to bring on said induction was by having the Obgyn poke his finger through my cervix with a little rubber hook and pop, as it were. Gives me the absolute horrors talking about, whether it's me or anyone else. Pop with a little hook all the sack of waters in which the embryonic fluid is containing my child in order to start the labour. So the doctor, who was a lovely doctor, he was generally a lovely person, came in and he tried to jolly me up, of course. It's because I was obviously terrified and in trauma. Like, things weren't great. I do feel sorry for these doctors. These poor white males with Asperger's, all of them, but they don't know that they're being insensitive when they say, buck up. Loads of women everywhere have babies without men. They just choose to have it with a donor, or they're lesbian or whatever. Said one doctor to me. I'm like, yeah, I understand that. I'm not dependent on the patriarchy to bring my child into the world. It's just that I had a man who wanted to be there when I had the baby, and then he died suddenly, and so it was still overwhelmingly sad that he couldn't be there in the flesh, as it were. And when it's your fifth child and you're used to going through labours with your partner by your side to bring the welcome child into the world together, was overwhelmingly tragic and traumatic and stressful to suddenly find yourself doing it without him. But anyway, so the Obgyn broke my waters. He came with a little rubber. It's basically like a little tiny rubber condom with a hook on the end of his finger to pop the waters. And he said, look, it's basically a little pygmy condom, he says. He says, although apparently that's the only thing about pygmies that aren't actually pygmies. They have normal sized human genitalia, he said, in an awkward Asperger's moment of trying to jolly me out of the trauma I was suffering. I mean, lovely man, they were trying to help. And then he stepped back, and I was I was trying to laugh. I really was. I was trying so hard to humour him, humouring me. I was being kind of psychotic, and he suddenly said to me with a complete serious expression on his face, says, "May I offer you some serious life advice?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Never play cards for money." Which was somewhat unexpected and made me laugh. And to this day, when people are always scrutinising my face to see what I'm really thinking, I always think to myself, never play cards for money, because I do have a rather expressive face, as I say. And when I'm actually acting in a role, or I'm telling a joke that requires a straight face to the punchline, I can usually cope, because it's with purpose and whatever. But if it's it's just me, I'm not a fibber, because I know to bear false witness is wrong was drummed into me early as a child. So, so there's a difference between lying for one's own selfish interest and portraying a role. And so I don't often lie. It's a wrong thing to do. Tricking people is wrong, and lying is tricking people. If we don't have an agreed reality, an agreed truth as a human race, then the entire universe will implode, metaphysically and practically. Which rather brings me around to my subject for today, which is, of course, religion. Now, as I've said in the description and things, I was christened as a child in the Church of England. You know what the Jesuit priests say? You know, give me the child before 7, I'll give you the man. And of course, Jesuits would say that, wouldn't they? Because women don't exist except as something to bring tea and bear more children to be swallowed up into the priesthood, as far as Catholicism is concerned. I fail to understand why the devotion of Irish women still holds to priests and clergy in the 21st century. It's like you see them in shops, like you're queuing first thing in the morning, like, you know, drop the kids at school, go and buy bread and milk before you go out for the day. You want to get on with things. A priest walks in, and the woman behind the counter will let them cut in. For no reason other than he's wearing a dog collar. And he's driving the flasher's car in the car park and is parked in a handicap zone. I shit thee nay. It's like a Father Ted sketch, but it's real. It's really happening. You see, when I was in Australia, because I am Australian, I once met an Irishman who was from Dublin, and he was a real estate salesman. And I said, "Oh, Ireland! I always wanted to go to Ireland, the way you always do. Always want to go to Ireland." And he said, "Oh, you know, there's lots of things to see there now, and you don't have to go to Dublin. There's lots of different airports you can fly into now." And he told me about this place and this project, which just had me in fits of laughter. This was in the very early 2000s. He had me in absolute fits of laughter, this Irish fellow in Australia, because he was telling me about how a priest in Ireland had seen a business opportunity. So he had cottoned on to this myth by peasants out in the west of Ireland that they'd seen like an apparition of Jesus and his family in like a nativity sort of scene in a cow paddock in the late 19th century. And although the priest knew it was all crap and utter bullshit, he still used it to create a tourism industry and create infrastructure by convincing the government and by raising money from the fearful and ignorant to build an international airport in the west of Ireland in the middle of nowhere, like no big centres and whatever, just in the middle of a bog. They plonked down an airport, and all these stupid Americans were then constantly flying in from the States to trace their ancestry and go to the fecking, but most importantly, to go to this fecking new holy site, which is like just like Father Ted's, the holy log or the holy well, or like, how do they come up with this? How do they come up with the with the definition of what's holy and what's a real relic and all this sort of thing. It's like make up the plaster saints as they go along. It's entirely mad. But it worked, and it created this massive tourism industry where people go around like selling like necklaces made in China, but then ferried all the way over here and then resold, to people who consider themselves pilgrims as opposed to like the brainwashed. And never in my wildest dreams, when I was laughing uproariously at this tale from the Irishman about all the mad people who live in the west of Ireland who believe that, like, a Palestinian Jewess from the Iron Age, like, appeared in a fucking cow paddock in the 19th century in Ireland. Never did I dream in a million years that I would end up living 5 minutes from said airport, surrounded by the mad fuckers who actually still believe it happened. You'll have to excuse me. It's like, tickling my throat, as it were. But yes, so what do? But I marry an Irishman a considerable time after this was told to me. Marry a completely different Irishman who, although baptized in the Catholic cult, is more scientifically inclined, shall we say, and knows that it's all bullshit. And so I didn't think I would have to contend with brainwashing and religion and dogma and that sort of thing. And then said Irishman and I logged up in Ireland and ended up settling in Mayo near and amongst the madness. See, it's extraordinarily unfortunate that Irish nationalism and republicanism became inextricably entwined with the cult of the Catholic Church, because Protestantism, as far as the Irish seem to understand it, or Catholic Irish seem to understand it, is the sole domain of the monarchy of England, which isn't, of course, the case. I do not approve of the institution of monarchy any more than I approve of the institution of churches. So, as far as I'm concerned, the premise of a kingdom in the 21st century, founded on the, on the basic assumption or declaration of the divine right to rule, is utter nonsense and exploitation of the masses. It's basically, monarchy is one family with wealth and cronies, takes land from other people with less wealth and convinces them to join them because they assert that an invisible deity has told that family that they are of magic blood and their DNA is better than everyone else's. So you have to bow the knee to them. You have to swear fealty to a family that is saying that, like, God has told us that we're on the right side, so you have to give us everything and obey us under penalty of death or disloyalty to your country, which doesn't really bear much intellectual scrutiny, does it? Particularly when you look at the Saxe-Coburg, Mountbatten Windsors, like Prince Andrew, one would argue, is hardly a true representation of God's will on earth if all he's going to do in life is swan around living off other people's monies, like squaffing champagne and raping 17-year-old girls, and denying it many years later in the papers and on the BBC. Like, if you believe in Jesus, then you have to say that Jesus did not behave anywhere near the same as Prince Andrew. Therefore, as God's representative on earth, as head of the church, I don't think the English/German royals bear much scrutiny. So I'm certainly not arguing for Protestantism as an alternative for Catholicism. What I'm saying is they're both as rotten as each other, because they're both designed, as are all organised religions, to uphold the status quo of the wealth gap between the elites, who have all the power and the propaganda and can change the dogma anytime they want and pretend it was because God told them to. Or what does Dougal say in Father Ted? How is it like you couldn't eat fish on Fridays, but now it's okay? So that's a very reasonable question. What, God said it's okay now, did he? Oh, yes, he did. There are many Dave Allen jokes on religion, which is why he was banned in Ireland for so very long. So, like, my favourite Irish comedian from a formative age was Dave Allen, and a lot of people in Ireland have never heard of him because the church had him banned, which sort of sums up my argument entirely, doesn't it? Like, if a church is having enough influence on the state to have television and writings and things banned under blasphemy laws, you have to ask yourself, are you not living in the dark ages, intellectually speaking, as far as the retardation of human progress is concerned? The puppies concur. So whether it's Catholicism or Protestantism, it's all about, like, the people wearing funny hats, dressed with gold leaf, sitting in gold thrones, telling the fearful and ignorant, unwashed masses that they have to do as they're bloody well told. And sadly, one look at the fearful and ignorant masses storming the Capitol on January the 6th because they think televangelists are speaking the truth about Republicans. You have to wonder why all these fearful and ignorant people sort of like have to find like structure for their 21st century life in misquoted Iron Age myths from the Middle East. Like, it's so mad. How is Bob Earl from Tennessee, how does he assimilate into his life? Like, ridiculous premise of living by rules made by tribal, like, goat herders several millennia ago. And I didn't even know that, like, astronomical patterns. They thought the earth was flat. The people who wrote the Bible thought the earth was flat. That's it's referred to in the brilliant Academy Award-winning Australian animated film Harvey Kompit, by the way. People who wrote the Bible thought the earth was flat. That pretty much dismisses the whole book as a structural framework for life in the 21st century, don't you think? Or any other myths of the same era. But then we saw people lining up for the Trump rallies the other day. They were all shouting out to each other via megaphone, "Did we land on the moon? No. Did we land on the moon? No." So it's like Bob L from Tennessee, who's fronted up with his MAGA hat and his T-shirt of Trump on a velociraptor holding an AR-15 as the next Messiah. They think the earth is flat too. But then you see interviews with them and they're just like, they're just looking for someone to talk to. That's it. It's just the lonely and vulnerable, exploited by the rich and powerful. And they'll believe anything if they want to. Whether it's that there was a Palestinian Jewess wandering around a cow paddock in the 19th century, or whether Trump is going to save all the fetuses that Republicans imagine are being sacrificed to invisible devils every day because of Fox News and Rupert Murdoch. The guys in the silly hats in the Catholic Church are very rarely of any better nature than the average guru who will spring up in a rainforest somewhere wearing orange robes, telling middle-aged hippies that he is the way to eternal life and all you have to do is drink the Kool-Aid and hack the arms of all your children. It's the same principle. I mean, religious mania is interdenominational, you might want to say. Schizophrenia is very much interfaith. And dogma will only provide the mentally unstable an excuse for their behaviour. For instance, I have a friend in Australia. She's now an elderly woman. But when she was a young woman, and she was brought up in the Protestant faith, but has gone off to splintered churches and things along her spiritual journey, shall we say. She had an experience once where she had what was termed then as a nervous breakdown, probably in the 70s. And she was took all her clothes off and was given an injection and carted away by the men in white coats for a little bit of a rest in the mental health facility. An asylum, it was known then, but now it's known as mental health facilities. She was carted away because she was deeply unwell because of trauma in her life. But when the medication sort of kicked in and she emerged from the cloud of anxiety and delusion and whatever was going on in her head, she found that she was standing on a chair in the day room at the mental health facility, being Joan of Arc. But she sort of gradually realised as the meds kicked in that there were 3 other Joan of Arc. Joans of Arc? Joan of Arcs. There were 3 other Joans preaching about, English and horses and God and things in the day room at the mental health hospital. None of them were even French. But it goes to show, if someone had decided they were Harry Potter and got a bit too into it and thought they were Harry Potter and got dragged away to a mental health facility and realised that there were 3 other Harry Potters in there also doing the same thing and had the same revelation that perhaps they weren't just feeling very well, then the Protestants would probably say, thank goodness that that young man was rescued from the evil world of witchcraft and Harry Potter. Because I remember when Harry Potter first came out in the 90s, there were local Protestants in my hometown who actually thought that Harry Potter was like satanic and dangerous. I mean, we just had Halloween here in Ireland, which is a misappropriation of various pagan festivals by the Catholic Church so as to make the Jewish rebels slightly calmer under the Roman Empire. So wherever the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church took the new religion, they just swallowed up all the festivals of the existing theologies and religions that already existed. I mean, there was a great deal of Celtic spirituality and, symbiosis in these islands before the Romans, sent out their missionaries accidentally or by design, and everything got tarnished with what they referred to the Enlightenment, what other people refer to as genocide. But the pagan festival, which is just to celebrate the changing of the seasons, harvest festivals and things, were then appropriated into Halloween, and then just turned into a meaningless excuse to carve out pumpkins and buy American cards and that sort of thing. There was, in the 90s, when it started to become popular, the old Halloween thing out in Australia, the local Protestants held a counter party, an All Saints party at their local church. I'm like, is it a Halloween party? No, it's exactly the opposite. Pardon me? Oh no, it's an All Saints party because Halloween is demonic. Like, what? I'm not saying there aren't such things as demons. I'm just saying Halloween is not going to turn little boys and girls into serial killers. We're talking about the same people who think that listening to Ozzy Osbourne in the 80s was going to make you cut off bats' heads. In the 90s they were still so they had an All Saints party in which they went the local Protestants got together and had a little kids party where they talked about Jesus, so to avoid witches and things on Halloween, because thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. It's apparently in their dogma somewhere, which makes you a little bit nervous if you're practicing Wiccan at the time in the 90s. But again, it's not about what's in the books. It's about the intent. And religion is just an excuse to bully people and control people. So whether it's the Catholic Church bring in the laws of celibacy for their clergy in the guise of like obedience and poverty and utter devotion to our Lord. It's utter bullshit. They only brought in celibacy because married priests, when they casted, were leaving their possessions to their wives, and the money was disappearing out of the church's hands into private ownership. So they banned wives and families. On paper, however, one look at the countless children conceived by clergy and then abandoned or swept under the carpet, or the thousands, if not millions, of children persecuted, tortured, abandoned, neglected, and swept under the carpet or left in septic tanks by nuns and clergy in order to perpetuate the money-making machine that is the church, without the evidence of like children born to people in the church who weren't seen to be obeying the rules, as it were. You can't argue that any of that was done with any holy purpose at all. You can't say that any of those people are any better than like a serial killer in America who like decided like the devil was speaking to him through the local McDonald's. They're all the same people, wearing different costumes, but the message is all the same. Like, believe us when we say that there is a fearful deity on our side, and if you don't do as you're told, you'll not only suffer in this life, but you'll suffer in the next life for an eternity. And people swallowed it up in the Iron Age and all through the Industrial Revolution. But you have to ask yourself, why the hell are they still swallowing it now? Well, most of the world doesn't. Most of the developed world doesn't. Most of the developed world manage to get to like a decent vaccination rate, for example, but there's still Fruit Loops out there attempting to claim religious exemption from modern medical science. And while it might be practical, some might say, to just allow the fearful and ignorant Bible bashers to die out, ironically, in a demonstration of the Darwinism theory that they don't subscribe to, is not the right thing to let them do it, is it? Because it causes harm to the rest of the community as a whole. It's people who say, well, okay, if Bob Earl wants to die of the COVID for Jeebus, then let him. I can certainly understand that sentiment. But the reality is that Bob Earl turns up at the emergency ward in trauma with his family, who all believe the same brainwashing bullshit. And then they proceed to impact all of the staff who are trying to save their lives with further trauma. So it's like you've got the doctors, the nurses, the frontline workers, everyone, regardless of their religious beliefs or emancipation from, still obliged from a humanitarian, ethical point of view to do no further harm, still morally and legally obliged, one hopes, to save the lives of the people appealing to them for help, even while denying that science is real. And that's where the world is today. But it's always like, well, let's not. It's like, well, from a postmodernist perspective, you might say, an agreed reality is what shapes the universe. Schrodinger's cat, for example. It's like if everyone in the room expects the cat to be dead when you open the box, and the cat was probably dead. Until you open the box, you don't know if the cat is dead or not. It's both. But if everyone's expecting it to be dead, then usually it probably is. If you don't share an agreed reality, then nothing is true, is it? And now we're living in a world where the media refers to it as a post-truth world, because people go on to networks and just blatantly lie. There used to be broadcasting regulations where if you told a lie on television, you could be sued or put in prison because you're misleading the public and it's harmful to the greater community. And then Murdoch just flouts all decent sense of morality and truth every day by establishing Fox News and people who just go on there and blatantly lie and misrepresent and lead the fearful and ignorant up the garden path all the way to the Capitol where they murder police officers. And ironically, the entire time they're doing it, they're claiming that they stand up for Christian values. But whether you believe in Jesus or not, Christian values are very much not taking a gun into Parliament. That would be the opposite of Christian values. Right. As I said, I was raised Protestant. I learned Bible stories and the teachings of Christ as a very young child. I mean, the Jesuits, as I said, say, give me the child before 7, I'll give you the man, because I don't care about daughters or women. Well, the Protestants got me early, because by the time I was 7, I was swearing allegiance to my Queen, my country, and God, by which I mean the Protestant Church, all as part of the initiation ritual of a brownie guide, which is, pretty much similar to the old Hitler Youth when you'd look at it. In point of fact, that's exactly why the scouting movement was formed. It was just like training children in survivalist and methods and things in order to prepare them for the armed forces a bit later on. It's exactly like Hitler in principle. And in point of fact, when I was talking about patriarchy, when I was a brownie guide, we weren't allowed to camp. And if you're only a brownie, you weren't allowed to camp until you're a girl guide. But the Cub Scouts were allowed to camp before they were scouts because they were boys. Boys were allowed to camp at a younger age than girls. Mad, isn't it? Still, in my lifetime, church was still held up as a way of enforcing sort of like patriarchal discrimination in the wider, broader society. And people from a younger generation in Australia find who look like me find it hard to even conceive that could have happened. But then there are parts of America and parts of the world where people who look like me not only but still believe in that, but they're taking guns into the Capitol to try and keep it like that. It's like, they still talk about like single income nuclear families with a man and a woman and 2 kids growing up to do exactly the same thing, working 9 to 5, going to church, doing Bible study, because they want to live in a world that never really existed. But they saw it on the television. That's all it is. It's like Hollywood propaganda and television propaganda beamed into the living rooms of ordinary Americans, made them think that the social construct was something entirely different from what it really was. And they get very, very angry when they found out they're being lied to. But they don't get angry at the people who lied to them. They get angry at the scapegoats. There's people who are making the television series about perfect white people living in wealth and luxury and being, casually funny and decent all the time. Men get angry when they find out their life isn't going to be like that. And then they have meltdowns. And then they make films like Falling Down, which are like a white middle-aged male goes postal, and everyone declares him a working class hero instead of a psycho. That was the early 90s, and that's sort of where the rot could be seen coming from a long way, because I bet you ask most of those middle-aged men storming the fucking Capitol about the movie Falling Down, I bet they've seen it, and I bet they all thought that that character was really justified in whipping out a gun at McDonald's because breakfast has stopped being served. No. Whipping a gun out is never fucking justified in McDonald's, you idiots. They're just looking for someone to follow. But as Monty Python said in Meaning of Life, you don't have to follow me, you don't have to follow anybody. You're all different. Yes, we are all different, shout the crowd. And one little voice says, I'm not. Ironically. But it's sort of, perhaps that's where the cognitive dissonance stems from, doesn't it? America has triumphed in the constant propaganda of the rights of the individual as opposed to the common good. I have every right to own every AR-15 ever made and stockpile them in my house. And I don't care if that makes you and your kids nervous, because I've got the right to do it. And they're the same people who say, Jesus said he loves us. Do you think Jesus had a stockpile of AR-15s in a school district? No, he didn't, if he existed. If he existed, the things he said were about love and forgiveness and be nice to women and be nice to children and, don't borrow money off the men in the temple because their interests are not at your, their heart is not devoted to your best interest. Everything that Jesus was ever meant to have said is in direct contradiction to people storming the Capitol and people on Fox News telling them to go storm the Capitol. And yet they've convinced them through mass propaganda. When I was in my mid-20s and I had several kids, a couple of them went to a Catholic school, because it was a nice community school, and I was unaware at the time of just how extreme the dogma was in its brainwashing, and how very committed Catholics are sometimes, in this particular school, to preserving the image of the church as opposed to educating children. But I found myself on the school board, as it were, and I went along to Catholic education organisation, like one of their meetings, like inter-district meetings, and I went there. And so I'm sitting there, and one of their spokesmen got up and says, "Who can address the assembly at large?" Says, "Who can tell me who is the greatest, most successful propagandist of all times?" What the hell? I was a journalist at the time, on the school board, though. Sitting there. Yeah, I can answer that question because no one else is interested. I was unaware at the time that white men, slightly naive, I was unaware at the time that most white men only asked rhetorical questions. Or at least they believed the questions to be rhetorical, because he didn't want anyone to guess or tell him who the most successful propagandist was in history. He wanted to tell you. I put up my hand, and he was surprised that a girl had put up her hand, and he said, like, yeah. And I said, Joseph Goebbels. And everyone spun their head around to stare at me. And this guy looked at me and was like someone taken back. He said, interesting, but no, it was Jesus Christ. And I thought, no. Jesus Christ didn't even have a fucking printing press, you idiots. Oh my God. And if you can convince an entire population of a country to herd their neighbours onto cattle trucks and send them off to be exterminated, you've pretty much overruled Jesus's reach of propaganda, haven't you? So I think Joseph Goebbels tops him out on that one. If Christ ever existed in the first place, which he didn't. Of course, there was some guy called Jesus on the sentence. There were loads of guys called Jesus on the census. You can find someone with the same name as me, living in the same school district as me in the 1990s, who hasn't done half the shit that I did. But in 2,000 years' time, historians will go, could this be the same Denise? No, it could be. But it's 2,000 years later, so it's pretty unlikely that any of it was actually true. I mean, get 6-year-olds in a circle and teach them the game of Chinese whispers. That's as much a solid foundation for the laws of your country and your very existence as it is depending on tribal myth from a different country 2,000 years later. And yet, and what set me on this, I mean, I'm always pondering, just how people deceive themselves so blindly with religion. And it's escapism. It's just escapism and comfort. You look at a church service, particularly in the Catholic Church, it's hypnotic. They know what they're doing. It's mass hypnotism. The chanting, the music, the ritual in the same order, day in and day out. The incense swinging, the chanting, the same word said, day in and day out. The incense swinging, the chanting, the same word said, day in and day out. You see, it's hypnotic, it's calming, but you may as well be chanting Om. You could be chanting anything. You could be just repeating Cookie Monster songs to yourself. It's about the ritual, it's not about the content. it's exactly the same principle that applies to poker machines or playing Halo. It's all lights and bells and whistles at the right spot that rewards you and gets your endorphins and serotonin and dopamine flashing and engaging at the right moment. Makes you want to keep coming back and back and back and back until you feel like not quite right unless you're doing it every day. And then they've got you. I mean, I don't look at people who are religious with contempt. I honestly don't. I understand it. It's very tempting to think that there's, it's tempting in this universe when you feel so very, very alone and insignificant and friendless to want to find community. But you can find community without pandering to patriarchal dogma that oppresses everyone else who isn't a white, straight, able-bodied man. Puppies concur. But the reason I thought I would specifically blog on the old religious dogma and madness and delusional zealotry that manifests in mental illness is not only my friend who thought she was a Joan of Arc. Oh, incidentally, any old white church-going male that believes in Joan of Arc, but trolls Greta Thunberg, can kiss my rational dissenting ass. Because you can't honestly be expected to believe that Joan of Arc was receiving direct messages from God, and so the church and the state went to war with her, and she's now patron saint. You can't be expected to believe that, and then turn around and criticize a young woman older than Joan of Arc was alleged to have been at the time of the myth or events, and not realize that everything Greta Thunberg says is actually backed up by a scientific fact in an era where we can actually sort of fact check what Greta Thunberg is saying, and we have the historical evidence of at least 40 years of oil companies and other industries betraying the planet and ruining the planet when they knew what they were doing could cause the end of humanity and extinction. They go to church. Oil executives go to church and say they believe in God and Christ and the American dream, and that and they go to televangelists who preach prosperity gospel. They ignore the whole memo about rich men, camels, and needles and building up your treasures here on earth, and instead say, if you post me $5, then Jesus will give you $5 back. And people fall for it. They still fall for it because everyone's sad and desperate. But as I said, the main catalyst for my vlog on the madness of religion and the common human cause of wanting to find community, but we can do it without the dogma in order to progress as a human race, was the Chad and Laurie Daybell case. For those of you who aren't aware who Chad and Laurie Daybell are, they are currently on trial, or being held pending trial, for the murder of most of their family, linked to very high insurance claims, and the Church of the Latter-day Saints. They started off as Mormons, and then they decided to take on their own splinter cult, or develop their own splinter cult, and combine all the different dogmas from Joseph Smith talking through his hat, crap narrated in the 19th century to like ignorant pilgrims out in the woods somewhere in America, combine that all with like, you know, theocracy from Judeo-Christianity in order to nominate herself like, you know, a living being, a living immortal being on earth that can do whatever she wants, and went ahead and murdered her children and several husbands and stuff in order to do so. She's seriously unwell. Seriously unwell. But she comes from a family with religious extremism and incest, by all accounts. And who knows? Maybe she would have like seized onto a random book or a random music recording or something and still gone potty. But it's the religion that sort of was seized upon by her as the reason in her mental illness to profit herself and just do whatever she wanted, because she decided she was an incarnation of her prophets somehow. Just like my friend who thought she was Joan of Arc. But fortunately, my friend who thought she was Joan of Arc didn't go around murdering families for it. I think one of the most interesting things for me personally about the Laurie Daybell case is there's now all these interviews coming out, police interviews and media interviews with people who knew her and saw that she was unraveling and that her family was covering up her religious beliefs and saying that she was harmless, just let her do it because she's the only way she can cope with her alternative reality. And then she murdered people. Is it one of the reasons that Laurie Daybell gave for thinking that she was living in like an alternative universe where she was queen of Mormons or something, basically, is that she was convinced that her husband, one of the ones she murdered, was not the same person she married because he was definitely an inch shorter. And so she took it when that happened, and she was unable to. She was convinced that her husband was not the same one she married because he was definitely an inch shorter. And that played into her, she was unable to assimilate that into her psyche. She was unable to like take that information on board. If my husband is an inch shorter, then he's not my husband. If he's not my husband, who is he? Now, she wasn't informed by like 1950s horror films. She probably never heard of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So she didn't think it was an alien. She belonged to a Mormon cult. So she just started mixing up in her head, which like sent her off, that she was already unwell, sent her off the rails, but started being all entwined in the mythology, and she murdered him, having insured him up the wazoo first. But that made me think of a particular experience that the Fenian and I went through. And it's on public record. This isn't. We've talked about it to family and friends, and I've talked about it before in radio shows and things. And it's mad. I know it's mad. But on the other hand, is it mad? Yeah, it's mad. About 11 years ago, my friend wanted to introduce the Fenian and I to her boyfriend at the time. He was a backpacker from Galway, living in Perth, Australia, where we all were at the time. And so we went along to an Irish pub, middle of the afternoon, because I was pregnant and I was just going to have like a lemonade and an early dinner before I went on to my shift at work. And the Fenian came along as well, just to meet the new boyfriend, and then he was going to go straight back home and look after the kids, so he wasn't drinking either. We weren't drinking, we were sober. And we just got there, And my friend came along and introduced us to her boyfriend from Galway. And this guy was huge. He was one of the tallest guys we've ever seen. He was at least 6'5", 6'4", 6'5". His brother was there also, and he was also a man mountain. And I was watching them at the bar, standing next to the Fenian. The Fenian's a tall man. In Ireland, he's a tall man. He's 6'1", and shoulders, a broad axe handle across, that sort of thing. He's a big guy. But the boyfriend from Galway and the boyfriend's brother absolutely dwarfed the Fenian. He was massive. And Fenian came back from the bar with my lemonade and whatever, and said, "They breed them big in Galway, don't they? Look at the size of those fuckers." And they were huge. They're absolutely massive. They're huge. I'm like, God, well, Galway, what, they're like a standing cow shit or something? Is that how they grow? Which is like a joke in Australia. Oh, yeah, it must be all the cow manure they stand in to grow so big. And we thought, well, yeah, big in Galway, man mountain, whatever. And then we bumped into him again with my friend, the girlfriend, in a queue outside another pub. A couple of months later, and he was an inch shorter than the Fenian. There's no explanation for this. He was just suddenly not a man mountain. He was suddenly an inch shorter than the Fenian. He looked exactly the same. He was just smaller. And I was standing there and I watched him interacting with Fenian, and we chatted and whatever, and we walked away. Fenian said, and so let's say my friend's name, the girlfriend, let's say her name was Sam. Fenian said, "Does Sam have a new boyfriend?" I said, "No, that's the same boyfriend we were introduced to a couple of months ago. That's exactly the same one." And it wasn't a new boyfriend. I'm still Facebook friends with this guy, with this same guy that went from tall to not so tall. He's a real person, and I'm still Facebook friends with him. And I've never told him about this thing. And the thing said, "How?" I'm like, "I don't know." I said, "Glitch in the Matrix?" And Finn said, "He was bigger than..." I'm like, "I know." And we actually walked back to the other pub where we first met the guy and looked to see if there was a step, to see if it had, if the floor was uneven, if there was any logical reason why this guy would go from a man mountain from Galway, just as a guy who's a bit inch shorter than Feeney. Still same name, same looks, same gestures, same everything. It's just head shrunk. A glitch in the Matrix, and there's no rational explanation for that. There's no rational explanation for it. But it's not it's not the first weird fucking shared experience that I've had with anyone. But it didn't make me immediately assume that he was an imposter and therefore disposable for insurance money, because we must now be living in the revelations, the way Laurie Daybell decided that her husband was now an inch shorter, so he must be an imposter sent from Satan. She could just insure up the wazoo and then bump off because she was blessed. It's a difference, I suppose, between rational dissent and being able to appropriate wildly bizarre incidents into your existence and go, okay, can't explain it, but I know it's got nothing to do with the Bible or any of the dogma that I was brought up with. I mean, Jesus Christ in his teachings didn't say, by the way, should anyone turn up and be a bit shorter, this is what you should do. I acknowledge he didn't leave a guidebook for that sort of thing. But on the other hand, being able to integrate into your psyche, your human experience, books besides the Bible, quotes like, "There's more under heaven and earth than is dreamed of in your philosophy, Horatio," from Shakespeare, means you're just able to shrug and go, to quote Homer Simpson. Like, it's bizarre, it shouldn't be real, but we've both witnessed it. Just move on. And don't attribute it to the Bible, because that's only going to get you in. That way leads madness. Into that way leads madness. It's, yeah. Poor old Laurie Daybell and poor old Laurie Daybell's victims. As I mean, it was like, she could have stood on a chair in a day room thinking she was Joan of Arc, but she was brought up in a different religion. So instead she thought she was like somehow the bride of Moroni, like the made-up angels of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Give me the child before 7, I'll give you the man indeed. So what's the point of all this? My point is, raise our children to believe that there are more things under heaven and earth than dreamed on in philosophy, and not in the church. Don't teach our children to believe what the men of the church are trying to teach them, because it's not going to benefit anyone at large. It has brought us to a very, very uncertain place in human history today. There you go. That was part of my religious madness. I'm going to get on with the rest of my day. And I'll thank everyone for subscribing. Go and check me out on Patreon. Go and look for my other podcasts on Spotify. And I'll see you when you got nothing on, as always.